is one of the most physically and mentally demanding segments of any piano piece that I know, as part of the cadenza, the first movement of the Rock 3. So yeah, I'm pretty excited to make this vlog on what I consider to be, in a word, if I had to use one word to describe it, I would say epic. And I mean epic in the literal epic sense of the word, as far as like an epic poem or a journey, this epic journey like Homer's Odyssey or Lord of the Rings or something, just incredibly long, detailed journey. So the cadenza starts about 11 minutes into the first movement, and it's over 3 minutes long. It's an incredibly long cadenza. For those of you that don't know what a cadenza is, it's the part in a concerto, which is for solo instrument and orchestra, that the orchestra drops out and the soloist gets to play a solo. Not many are 3 minutes long. That's essentially putting an entire solo piece in the center of the first movement of the work, and it's tied into all the themes that came before. As I mentioned in my previous video, there are 2 cadenzas that Rachmaninoff wrote. I did choose to go for the ossia cadenza, which is the one on top. It is a bit, well, actually substantially longer in length than the other one, and it is more dense and chordal. It has this big chord section, which I'll get to in a minute. The other cadenza is a lot quicker, a lot more fast passage work. It's also really cool in its own right. I just like the top one, so that's the one that I chose to go with. I'll probably learn the other one at a different date. So much of classical music is a contextual art form, which means that where you came from and where you're going matter greatly. One of the cool things about this cadenza is what happens immediately preceding it and immediately after it. So preceding it, there's this section which is kind of a C6 section to me. It has all this passage work which kind of ebbs and flows. I think intentionally I tried to play it a little bit dizzying way. And then at the end of it you have this beautiful line. So already from the beginning of this cadenza, it begins to make use of the original main theme, this, and it begins to transform. If I just track the upper line from the beginning of the cadenza, you can really clearly hear the theme. But even though you can hear the theme, it's fragmented. So before we're at the beginning, it's all in one voice. It's very fluid, very legato. It flows through. Now you have something that's becoming more jagged. So it uses the themes, but it's sort of beginning to reorder them. And then it begins to continue to build in intensity, and it begins to go up the scale. So now you have... and it continues going... I'm not playing it as is, I'm playing sort of the outlines of the chords because that helps me to understand the structure of the piece. And when you understand the structure of it, it's, for one thing, much easier to memorize. For another thing, it's much easier to know where you're going and to have a line that makes sense. The cadenza itself can be divided into a few main sections, but the first part of it is marked by these chordal figures, which would be like brass if it was an orchestra, and it sort of announces the different sections or different tonal centers that you'll be in. Here's the first one. There's the second one. And here's the third one, which is in a group of two. Essentially, what I want to happen is each of these chords becomes progressively louder and faster. And then you have all this falling figures in the middle. And then each one becomes a little more manic, I guess you could say. It's like watching a theme unravel, and what was once so innocent becomes this monster by the time you get to here. So the entire first section of the cadenza is from here, continues through this page all the way to here, and he even has a different tempo marking. And then the third section, I would argue, starts around here, although there is some lead up into it. Interestingly, the two different cadenzas he wrote join up at this point. So they start off completely different, and then they meet like at a fork in the road, and no matter which cadenza you play, everyone plays this section. But the whole point of the first segment, in my mind, at least what I'm trying to do, is to build tension until everything kind of explodes at this point right here. So what I did as far as successively louder and faster for the chords, I'm going to try to do for every sequence that occurs. So coming out of those chords that I showed before, and it all reaches an apex here. I actually did something a little different there. I tried to build speed here. And then I actually give more time there because it's interesting. The hands are being spread apart. It's almost like a stretching of tension here. Plus, I just want this to be really, really loud and percussive. And I notice when people rush it, it just, it loses the effect of the power. So sometimes speed can actually detract from the drama of a piece. And besides, there's no point in rushing there because right after you reach that huge chord, there is a presto section, and it's just going to take off and go faster and faster and faster. This presto section, I can't help but see it as like a scream or a shriek or some kind of battle, you know, when forces meet. And it's just the most intense clash that you could imagine. And that leads into the next allegro molto section with these just gigantic chords. I always think of a pipe organ when I'm playing this. He has you jumping around, playing in so many different registers, and the chords themselves are not complicated, but they're spread out over such a great distance. So if there's a D suspended chord, it's like he wants to cover the entire length of the piano to get all the sound he can out of it. So yeah, I'm definitely thinking pipe organ in this section. So you can again clearly hear the theme. But there's also an answer, so it's like statement, answer, statement, answer, and so on and so forth. And then later on it switches. And here's statement, which I try to bring out of my thumb. Answer. I just want to mention as a caution, when playing or learning a piece like this that is so loud for such a long sustained period of time and is so technically dense, it's important to not practice 100% sound and 100% effort much of the time. You shouldn't give everything because you run the risk of injury. So I learned that the hard way in the summer of 2018 when I was learning the first movement, and I actually injured my right hand here. First time I've ever injured myself in all my years of playing. I've never had any injury from playing. So it just started getting inflamed in the tendons on the back of my hand, especially these few fingers. And I had to take 2 to 3 weeks off. A lot of that could have been avoided, I think, if I had just toned down the intensity of my practice on this section and hadn't tried to bring out the full sound of those chords every single time. But it's a little hard when this piece is so dramatic and I just want to hear that sound, that brilliance of sound. So yeah, I definitely practice at a much softer dynamic much of the time. Immediately following that is the place where both cadenzas meet up. And it reaches this glorious D major chord. I think for the first time it cadences in a major key after several minutes of just becoming more and more distressed. But it's like fighting opposition. So you have this one part that's wanting to go higher and higher, and you have this one part that's wanting to go lower and lower. And it's this tension between the two. So that idea of pushing to extremes of the keyboard begins to happen again in a different way here. And how that segment comes crashing down, similar to what happened here, but before it comes down to that A and leads you into a minor key. This time, you reach this low D and it becomes this major chord that sweeps upwards, and you arrive at the super magical It's almost like escaping out of hell by the skin of your teeth. I realize that a lot of what I said is highly subjective in terms of my own personal interpretation of the work. But I think it's important to balance the two. So number one, it's very important to have an idea of the structure and the chords so that you know where you are and you don't get lost. But it's also important to have a view of, well, what is this music really trying to say? Because if it's just reduced down to a bunch of major chord here, suspended chord there, 5-to-1 transition here, doesn't necessarily mean anything to either the person playing, definitely not to the audience that's listening. So in other words, there could be a number of different ways to look at this. Others might look at it completely differently, but you need to have the musical framework to back up that idea of what the piece is trying to say. In regards to just learning the notes and making sure you have it memorized and in your fingers, there's this great quote by Abe Lincoln where he says, "If you give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'll spend the first 4 hours sharpening the axe." And for a musician, I think what that means is preparing things like your finger numbers. At the very beginning, when I was just learning this, my professor told me to go through and mark basically all the fingerings that I could in this cadenza because it's so thick and so dense. And it helped me greatly to learn the notes. Initially, it's far more tedious, but I think the payoff is really big, as well as analyzing the piece. And you can see I didn't go overboard as far as writing in literal chordal analysis in the margins, but I did go through and make sure I knew what all the chords were, which ones are diminished, which ones are major, how long a phrase is it an even or odd number of measures? That also helps, and it helps to prevent memory slips, I think, or at least help to find your way back. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to comment with any questions you might have, as well as like and subscribe for more upcoming videos, and I'll see you guys next time.